Welcome back to the county seat. We are talking about vegetation treatments, water conservation, and projects that are taking place around the state. Utah's been one of the most active states in handling these land improvement projects, and that's probably in great part due to the fact that Utah has partnered to leverage the money that's available to do these kinds of vegetation treatments. So joining us for that conversation are one of those partners, or representative thereof, Miles Moretti, who is the president of the Mule Deer Foundation. We also have Tyler Thompson, who works with the DNR in charge of their water conservation. I guess you would call it a division or project.
Yeah, Department of Natural Resources.
Right. So anyway, Tyler and Miles, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
How is it that Utah ended up just gathering all this attention for, people like you and Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife and all these different people got together and really, I mean, they've levered a bunch of money, $1 million+ easily. How did that happen?
Well, I'll go back a little bit. In the early 2000s, we had a severe drought in Utah where we had lots of vegetation die off. And there was, the Division of Wildlife Resources started a habitat initiative. And that started out, and then all of a sudden we had a guy named Mike Styler come in, and we knew him from the legislature, and he decided to call it the Watershed Restoration Initiative. And he took it clear back to Washington, D.C. to get funding and brought the partners together. So we give a lot of credit for Mike for his vision back then.
How has it worked?
So the way it works is we've got about 5 different regional teams with a bunch of partners from a whole bunch of different state and federal agencies, NGOs, sportsmen's groups. We all get together and develop these project proposals each year and implement those project proposals. And we figured out a way to kind of work across ownership boundaries. We figured out a way to work at a watershed scale. And we've done a lot of good work in the state.
Do you get buy-in from guys that have ranching allotments, even though a lot of what happens goes to wildlife habitat?
Absolutely. There is, over the course of the 12 years that we've been in operation, we've had about 500 different partners, and a good number of those are private landowners. So we actually try to elevate projects that include both federal, state lands as well as private lands as well. So there is quite a bit of benefit for the livestock industry, quite a bit of forage that's been produced, but also the wildlife as well benefit.
One of the critics of this entire project, and the fact that there's some coming up down south, has basically said that that this is a project to make more grazing land for cattle and sheep, and they say that that's what all these projects really are about. If that were the case, your group probably wouldn't be involved in it.
Absolutely. We're in this for healthy rangelands and healthy forests. And the bottom line is we have neglected our forests and rangelands for too long. And they are in such sad shape that the amount of grazing capacity on those lands is greatly reduced. If we can go in and do these habitat restoration projects, it's going to produce more forage for everybody, and the land's going to be healthier. And I don't care who you are, you should want that. I mean, some of the devastating wildfires we've had in the West, it's because we failed to manage our public lands. And that's not good for anybody.
Well, okay, but the groups like SUA, I mean, the cat's out of the bag as far as who's been running the ads lately, they would contend that the reason that the whole problem is that man has manipulated this through the years, and it should just be in the hands of Mother Nature.
Well, one of the things you have to remember is those ads are not designed to worry about what the landscape looks like. Those ads are designed to fundraise. And bottom line is if they really cared about the health of the land, they would work with us and they would be there as a partner and help us create these healthy landscapes. But they don't want to do that. They just want to fundraise off of what we're doing. And frankly, that commercial is a lot of misinformation. And that's just the world we live in today.
So I do want to talk about the fact that there's been this massive, and we can see pictures of it, where you take a snapshot from a location 75 years ago, mostly grasses, good grasses, a little bit of sage, a little bit of forbs, and a kind of a blurred line going into pinyon juniper stands, which I understand is important for wildlife because they got to have a place to hide out, but they can't eat it, so they also have a place to eat. You take a picture 75 years later, and there's nothing but pinyon juniper right down to the road. And a lot of the areas they're talking about down in Grand Staircase, that's how it's been. It's pinyon juniper and a road cut through the middle of it, and that's all there is. If you didn't treat it, what would it look like?
There's obviously an overabundance of pinyon juniper out there. That point is pretty hard to argue. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to diversify those even age stands. We're trying to come in and do what a fire would do, what Mother Nature would do. But we're doing it in a much more controlled fashion so that it doesn't get out of control. If we don't come in and manage those areas, it's like your garden. If you don't manage your garden, if you don't clip your lawn, it gets out of control and it gets dangerous, and we're just trying to go in there and make it so that there's a diverse variety of age classes and vegetation types.
And to follow up on that point, these forests, pinyon juniper forests, that have invaded in the last 50 to 100 years, they set up these catastrophic fires. And all we have to do is remember back to the Milford fire, how fast that was moving, and then go back, and those places that we didn't treat, there's just cheatgrass there now, and that's not good for anything, not good for wildlife, not good for livestock. But go back into those areas that even after the fire, this effort went back and restored those areas. They're back to where they should be.
Oh, yeah, I mean, all you have to do, if you pay attention to your environment, I noticed very drastically how different Fillmore looks driving in and out of that valley before Milford Flat Fire and after. I don't even think I'm in the same state. I mean, it is remarkable. How big of a deal is forage on this? I mean, you know, if we go in and do a vegetation treatment, you know, it looks pretty rough when you're done because you got chunks of, you got holes in the ground and you've got chunks of cedar sitting around, and I mean, it looks pretty cluttered.
Right.
But I understand that's the healthiest environment to get good grasses and things to grow.
Yeah, back to the garden analogy. You don't go in and just throw the seed on the ground and hope for the best. You go in and take the cover off. You go in and till the soil. And when you're doing that on 1,000 acres and using a chain, it looks pretty rough, and it's a very destructive process. But you go back to that area 5 years, 10 years after the fact, and the grasses have come back, the forbs have come back, the shrubs are back, the animals are back in there. It looks a lot different. You just have to kind of move past that ugly stage that's being depicted in that commercial.
And that's a short-term thing. I can tell you that the vegetation treatments come back fairly quickly. A devastating fire like Miller Flat, you still drive out there and there's dead trees standing everywhere. Does that look healthy? Does that look good? And the thing of it is these treatments increase forage capacity 100%, 200%, 1,000%, and it benefits everything. It benefits everything from a rabbit to songbirds, that diverse habitat, and of course, you know, then the big game and livestock also get to benefit from that. But it just produces so much more valuable forage to the ecosystem.
So could we actually keep everything in its prime condition if we just kind of did small, ongoing management projects? I mean, everything's got a life cycle. Forest's got a life cycle. We've got a life cycle. You know, can you keep us at 25 years old and all buff on the land by just doing little bits of treatment?
Well, one things we've learned is we don't go into those areas that have 400-year-old trees. We go into those areas that have 100-year-old trees or less. And that's the ones we want to focus on because that's what's invaded into the landscape. And we classify these things into phase 1, 2, and 3 vegetation types. And we try to focus on the 1s and 2s. That's where they're invading in. And especially species like sage grouse that potentially is listed as endangered, they don't like trees. they evolved in a landscape that was sagebrush and very few trees. And so part of this is we're not also doing a healthy landscape. We're trying to keep a species off the endangered species list.
Well, I think that's very funny, because this very ad we were talking about before, complaining that we're doing this treatment, is using footage from Hamlin Valley, which was, if I'm not mistaken, a sage grouse project to try and create better sage grouse habitat. Am I off on that?
No, you're right. That project, one of the benefits that we're looking for is to increase sage grouse in that valley, and all we're doing is pushing those trees back up the mountain, trying to produce, forbs and grasses and shrub cover for those birds. And we've actually shown, we have scientific proof that birds are moving back into these treatment areas very shortly after we complete them.
What I wanted to say is, one of the reasons why you say, why is the Mule Deer Foundation concerned about sage grouse? Well, I always tell people there are over 20 million acres in the West where sage grouse and mule deer overlap at some time during the year. Mule deer tend to migrate down from the high mountains down to the valleys, and that's where they overlap. And so to me, we get a double reward when we go in and treat these areas. Mule deer benefit, elk benefit, sage grouse benefit, and so that's why we're involved in these efforts.
I think that's kind of an interesting point, because somewhere in this whole rangeland war, so to speak, that we've got going on between the environmental NGOs and the Forest Service and everybody, it's their definition is partition. Well, this land has to be for this species. This land has to be for that species. And so, you can't have cattle and deer on the same range. You're doing it for one or the other. And you're saying that's not the case.
Not the case. And in fact, we have to do this together, because as I always tell people, if sage grouse get listed, I can't do mule deer projects, because that means I would be stopped. So we got to work together. And the one great thing about the sage grouse issue was that brought a coalition of landowners, federal agencies, state agencies, NGOs, and a lot of groups together for a common purpose. And it worked, and we were successful. The bird didn't get listed. So I think that's the kind of approach we have to take to this western landscape.
And we're actually elevating projects that have that goal in mind, that actually have these multiple goals, and we have a ranking process and a regional team process that actually elevates those projects. So that is our goal, is to try to provide a multiple benefit out there on the landscape.
The water also becomes, you call them water conservation projects, and so far everybody would take this conversation as saying range, but when Randy Julander, before he retired as a state hydrologist, I had a conversation with him once on another show, and he pointed out that the conifers, he said each conifer is like a large straw down into the water table, and it sucks up thousands of gallons a year and sprinkles them out into the environment. Is our water situation on the range, do the springs look a little bit better after you do the treatments? Does there seem to be a connection here that it's measurable or visible?
Yeah, absolutely. We've heard for years doing this, these different projects, that springs are starting to flow again, that ephemeral streams are starting to flow again. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there about water coming back after these treatments. And then Dr. Roundy out of Brigham Young University recently published a paper where he showed that the amount of available moisture in the soil after we do some of these treatments actually increases in the spring, which is extremely important for our projects when we have seed on the ground, by up to 29 days. And so having that moisture availability for our grasses and forbs is extremely beneficial.
And that's one of the things about pinyon juniper. There's no understory, there's no vegetation underneath the trees. And so when the water hits it, it pretty much runs off. When you got grass and forbs and shrubs there, that water gets to percolate into the ground. And we've had projects in northwest Colorado where we've removed pinyon juniper, and we actually found a spring we didn't know was there. Now it doesn't flow like it did historically, but it starts seeping back to the surface again. So we've seen that. We've not studied it, but but anecdotally we've seen that.
You guys are working on that, aren't you?
We are. So we've decided that it's something that we want to put some funding into and study. The issue is, measuring spring outputs and measuring ground level or groundwater and measuring stream water is difficult, and it takes a lot of time. So we're about 2 years into a very long-term study where the Watershed Initiative has funded the Utah Geological Service, and we're all instrumented up now. We've got data that's coming to us, and we'll be treating those areas in about 2 years and hope to see some actual data.
That'd actually be kind of interesting to see the results of that.
I'm excited for it.
So, Utah's doing projects. There are projects going on all over the West, and you're probably monitoring them. If you had to give Utah a report card, what would it be?
Well, Utah's leading the West in restoration projects. Everybody goes, how do we do this? And, in this day and age with tight federal budgets and things, it's hard for these states to get the funding that Utah has had for many, many years. And so they're trying, other states are trying, and they're making some limited success. But I give Utah an A++ because of the effort they've done. But that's because people have come together and said, we're going to make this work. We're not going to get in our individual agencies and our individual silos. And I don't see any state where that happens other than Utah.
Does you think that's because of Mike?
It's because of Mike. It's because of the legislature supporting us, the governor supporting us. It's because of that base funding that comes from tax dollars. That base funding from the state is extremely important when it comes to leveraging dollars. And then there's just something about Utah that we are all kind of built to work together. And there's just something about the way that we can come together and put projects on the ground that's been exciting to watch.
The other thing I'd add to that is I think you asked us about why are sportsmen involved with private landowners, and I think one of the things we've been able to convince our sportsman community here in Utah is wildlife spend a lot of the year on private land. So we can't just look about where are those deer and elk during the hunting season. Mm-hmm. If you're going to have deer and elk in hunting season, you've got to get them through the winter. And a lot of times that's on private land in Utah. So that's why we've evaluated that, hey, we may go do a project on private land. We may not get to hunt that area, but we know we'll get to hunt those animals in the fall.
Well, it does lead me to another question, which is cost. And cost ends up being, I kind of did the math, and I have been told that if you chain an acre of land, it's about $50 an acre. If you take a bull hog and grind it down individually, it's about $300 an acre, and it jumps to about $1,000 an acre if you send a guy out there with a chainsaw to thin stuff out and scatter it manually. So adding those numbers up, it says we've spent $1.7 million for. I couldn't make the math add up as far as the cost and the treatment goes.
So chaining treatments, when we're working in these infilled and even-aged mature stands of PJ, you basically have two options. You have the bull hog that you talked about that we're paying about $350, $400 an acre, plus the seed mix, which is usually another $100. And then chaining, which will cost us about $50 for each way that we chain, and we usually chain 2 ways plus the seeding on top of that. So by far chaining is the least expensive, but that's not the only reason why we use that method. And we don't use it a lot. We use it actually pretty sparingly these days. We use it in areas where there's not a lot of cheatgrass, there's not a lot of opportunity for invasive weeds to infill after because the soil disturbance can be so great. But the majority of our projects, because of the immediate benefit for fuels and fire, is bull hog projects.
And how is the end result different? I mean that's kind of remedial, but it might help explain things.
The end result 5-10 years down the road is actually pretty similar. What you get with a bull hog is because you're chipping those trees down to basically nothing, is you have an automatic or you have an immediate benefit for fire and fuels. So we've seen time and time again in those bull hog areas where you'll see fire roll up to those areas and lay down and stop, or provide an opportunity for our firefighters to go in and directly attack those areas. So chainings have the same long-term benefit. They just take a little bit longer for those trees to break down.
Okay, final thought for you guys, or obviously you have your own final thoughts if you have them, but my final question is, what is it that people see in these propaganda efforts, and I'm going to call them that because there's so much misinformation in them. What do they need to take away to correct so that they actually get a real picture of what's happening on the ground?
Well, I think they have to remember that you know, a picture of a even age stand of pinyon juniper that's invaded all the rangeland, it may look visually pretty, but it has no value to wildlife, livestock. Very few songbirds, anything live there. And what they don't realize is it's basically a desert. It just pushes out everything, and it isn't what was there naturally. And I think if we can tell the story that we're trying to replicate Mother Nature and go back to how Mother Nature was and how this area looked. I use an example of Oregon. When pioneers arrived in Oregon, there were 1 million acres of juniper or western cedar. Now there's over 6 million acres. That looks way different than today than it did when pioneers first got there. Utah is the same way. And there's millions of acres of pinyon juniper that's invaded in the last 40 years.
You know, you brought up a really good point that I never thought of before, because obviously in my recreation show, I've been out on Scoot-and-Paw Road off and on for 15, 20 years. And it used to be, it was PJ on both sides for miles and miles and miles. You didn't see anything but the sand and the road and the trees on it. You couldn't see the cliffs. But I never stopped to think about that before, that you couldn't hear the birds. And then we went back to look at this vegetation treatment that BLM sponsored down along Scoot-and-Paw. And when we went out on a range tour, Dr. Roundy was there. All of a sudden, it now dawned on me, I was hearing sounds of nature again.
Absolutely.
That I hadn't even thought of that.
Yeah, a much more diverse habitat.
Any final thoughts?
So, you know, my takeaway, especially related to the Sioux ad, is that there's always two sides to the story, and our side has a lot more folks on our side. And so I'd encourage people to go to our website, watershed.utah.gov, and learn about, you know, who we are, what we're doing, and how we're making things better in Utah.
You actually have some pretty good videos there.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, and one last thought for us, if you want to learn more about the Mule Deer Foundation, go to muledeer.org and to our website and learn about what we're doing.
Okay, final side shoot. How much of the money that you raise do you put into conservation projects?
We put over 88% of our money that we raise goes to mission accomplishment, and so we try to be as efficient as we can and get as much money on the ground, and that's where we're, no matter what state we're working in.
So primarily your goal is habitat improvement.
Absolutely. We're a habitat-based organization that just happens to have a critter group at our head. Mule deer is the species we focus on, but we're really a habitat-based organization.
Excellent. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining us today on the county seat. We'll be back with a personal look at how all of this looks when it's on the ground right after this commercial break.